At Morningstar Sustainalytics, we receive a lot of questions about defining KPI and SPTs. Here's our top 6 frequently asked questions. Where should a company or issuer start when identifying their KPIs?
So in case of company identifying KPIs, they should look at internally if they have done any materiality assessment. That's one way. The other way is public resources such as SASB Materiality Map or Finder, which gives the idea of material issues for 77 sub-industries, I think. Then there is ICMA KPI registry for SLB, which lays out lots of KPIs around several sub-industries that are core or secondary in nature. And if issuer already has ESG risk rating with us, that will help them determine the material issues they are facing, which is quite comprehensive in nature. So they can also use that resource to identify KPIs.
Is there a difference between KPIs for SLB and SLL?
So I think KPIs can remain same for SLLs or SLBs. What really differs is that the targets that they set is because they are forward-looking in nature, and the term of SLL and SLB can differ. The targets year, the observation date, might differ for SLL and SLB. So in a way, those targets are set for different years. The KPI can remain same in that case.
What is the difference between Scope 1, 2, and 3?
So Scope 1 emissions really relate to the issuer's direct operations. So any emissions coming from their own operations are the Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 is about them purchasing electricity, heating and cooling, and steam. So the purchased energy related emissions is the Scope 2 emissions. And then outside of that, anything that's upstream or downstream emissions from issuers' value chain, that's what the Scope 3 emissions is about.
Can you give an example of what is considered material and applicable in terms of emissions-related KPIs?
Generally, GHG emissions or emissions-related KPI are considered relevant, if not material, to most sub-industries. Even ICMA KPI registry considers that. So materiality really comes down to whether that business is carbon intensive in nature. So as we can imagine, hard to abate sectors will have GHG emissions as a material topic. What applicability will mean in this case is how much of their overall operations they have captured in calculating that GHG emissions. If they have a great extent of their operations being included, that means it has higher applicability, and thus we can rate it as highly material issue for that sub-industry.
How can issuers credibly incorporate their social targets such as diversity and inclusion, etc., into linked finance?
Yeah, so when issuers are considering any social targets such as diversity or occupational health and safety, they need to understand and know that those KPIs are material or relevant to their business, such as pharmaceutical companies setting targets on access and affordability to medicine is a material topic. And diversity is generally relevant to most issuers, if not all. So that's another way to say that diversity can be a KPI to consider for setting targets on, if especially when they have traditionally lagged performing on that KPI. So the credibility comes from the fact that issuers need to understand whether they need to improve substantially the performance around those KPIs. And if the answer is yes, they should be setting targets ideally for such social KPIs.
Can an issuer have 2 or more SPTs linked to the same KPI?
Short answer is yes, they can have 2 different targets for the same KPI. Basically, every single KPI can have multiple targets based on which year you are going to achieve that target. And ideally, we have seen some investors asking for issuers setting interim target for the same KPI as well as the final target for the same KPI. And it's an ideal practice because you don't want to have a transaction where you achieve the target and link it to coupon at the very end of that transaction. So it's a good practice sometimes to have multiple targets on the same KPI.